what's the premise of this book? What did you try to convey in writing it?
The purpose of the book is my own personal journey as an Israeli who was raised with in a very Zionist patriotic family into Palestine, having discovered Palestine at a relatively late time in my life. I was almost 40 years old when I ventured into Palestine and I met Palestinians for the very first time. And the story is a story of my progression from being an Israeli Zionist patriot, and realizing that there's another narrative, that there's another story, that we share the land with another people. And I relate through the story, my own story, and through the story of my family, the development of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and then where it is today and where I see it going in the future.
You come from a family with a yichus.
Yes, somewhat. My grandfather signed the Israeli Declaration of Independence.
Katznelson?
Katznelson,
There are
Avram
streets
Katznelson.
named after him.
That's right, Avram Katznelson. And my father was he was in the Palmach in the Haganah in '48, and then he was a general in 1967, the Six-Day War. He was also a member of the Knesset later on for one term. So yes, I come from some serious Zionist roots.
He's known as General Peled?
Yes, General Miko Peled.
Miko Peled.
Yes.
And were you a part of the IDF culture?
Yes, very much so. I mean, I always tell people I knew I could recite the ranks and the different corps of the IDF before I could read and write. And of course, I served my own 3-year, mandatory term when it came my turn. Of course, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I did it willingly and happily. And I talk about that in the book. I have an entire chapter called "The Red Beret" and what it meant for me to serve in the IDF.
Are you secular? Do you have any
Yes.
religious observance?
No, I'm not an observant Jew at all. No.
Do you have a strong sense of Judaism, or?
I have a strong sense of Judaism as an identity, of course, and as an Israeli too. Definitely, as an Israeli Jew. Yes.
But in your talk, in your book, you're critical of Zionism.
Yes, I am. I think the problem is that for Zionism, the issue of Eretz Israel has become a zero-sum game. In its inception, Zionism came about in order to solve a problem. Anti-Semitism, mostly in Europe.
Yeah.
And there are many streams of Zionism, and there are very different shades of Zionism. And the Zionism that took over and the Zionism that became the most prevalent was a very militant form of Zionism. And that was led mostly by people like Ben-Gurion, who believed that Israel should be the strongest, meanest country in the neighborhood, who preferred the military options to peaceful options throughout the history of the state, and created a very, very militant, very ugly form of Zionism, and that is what we have today. And that's why we have people like Netanyahu and Barak and so on in power today.
But wasn't the organized Palmach a response really to the anti-Semitism of the Arabs to the Jews coming there?
No, not at all. The Palmach was created in order to fight the British who were occupying the Middle East. After World War II, the British took over Palestine. And so the Palmach originally was created in order to fight them as a so-called underground terrorist group, or whatever you call it, resistance group. And that's why my father and others joined. Later on, it was trained and used in order to fight off the Palestinian Arabs. But the Palestinian Arabs did not have a group like that. In other words, when it came to the conflict, the one big year of the conflict between the end of 1947 and the end of 1948, the one year that we call the War of Independence, and the Palestinians call the Nakba, and where really the future or the fate of Israel and the fate of Palestine were determined, the Israeli forces, the Jewish forces, by far outnumbered and were much higher, had been better trained and had far better quality weapons than the Palestinians ever dreamed to have. The Palestinians never really had a military force.
Yeah, but they had the problems from the surrounding Arabs, Jordan.
Well, the other Arab countries invaded or tried to invade or entered the war after the British left. This was already May of 1948. By then the war had been going on for 6 months.
Yeah.
The fighting had been going on for 6 months with the intention of the Jewish forces and the mainstream Zionist movement to push out as many of the Palestinians who were supposed to be part of the Jewish part of the state, the Jewish part, because there was the partition. So the intention was to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians from Palestine in order to create a homogeneous Jewish homeland. Then in May of 1948, after the British left, the Egyptians and others came, but they were not as well trained, they were not as well motivated, they were not as well equipped as the Israelis, and they lost. Those armies were all destroyed and lost. And Israel, at the end of those 12 months between the United Nations resolution to create the State of Israel, to partition Palestine, and the end of the war, which was the end of 1948, the Israeli forces, the Jewish forces conquered 80% of the land, destroyed 500 towns and villages, and forcibly exiled almost a million people, or around 800,000 people. So obviously they had the upper hand, and it wasn't a miracle. It was because they were
had they not
trained.
prevailed, though, what would have happened to the Jewish state?
Nobody knows. I mean, the way the Jewish state. Well, it's not that they prevailed; they initiated the conflict.
Who did?
The Israeli forces were the ones that initiated the conflict.
What, by declaring sovereignty?
No, by going in and beginning the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians from Palestine.
Oh, you're talking about in 67?
No, I'm talking about in 48, at the end of 47. After the United Nations resolution, the Jewish forces began this campaign of ethnic cleansing.
And the Arab nations attacked Israel?
No.
They didn't?
No.
Israel launched?
Israel initiated the violence. The Israeli forces initiated the violence. The story that we're told, is that the small Jewish community was attacked by the Arabs. But the reality is, when we look at the forces at the end of 1947, and this is based on the reality on the ground of the facts as we know them. My father was served in it. The British intelligence had reports about this. The Jewish forces were somewhere between 30 and 40,000 fighting men, mostly men and some women. Palestinians did not have an equivalent force. They did not have an army. When you look at the two communities, you had the Jewish community that numbered about 500,000 or 600,000, and the Palestinian community that numbered maybe 1,203,000 at the time. And there were two societies, two communities that were growing, pretty much two states that were growing in parallel. They had separate education systems, they had separate healthcare systems, they had separate everything. They grew as two separate entities within historic Palestine, or Eretz Israel. The one thing that the Jewish community developed that the Palestinians never did is a fighting force, is a militia. And when the Jewish state was created by the United Nations, when the partition came about, the Israeli forces were prepared and ready and began to push out the Palestinians from the Jewish portion of Palestine. And that is what ignited the conflict. This is in contrary to what we learn as Israelis and what we learn as Jews. That's contrary to the myth
and how did
of what
you,
happened
how
in
did
48.
you learn this other narrative?
Well, it was very difficult. I learned it through speaking to Palestinians and meeting with Palestinians and hearing over and over and over the same old stories, reading books that were written by other historians other than the mainstream Israelis. And then later on, about 15 years ago, Israeli historians began writing these stories too. People like Ilan Pape and others began taking a look at the history and rewriting the history of 1948 and what actually took place and how this conflict began. And it was very difficult. It's very difficult for an Israeli to hear that the story that upon which you were brought up is false. But that's the reality. The reality that within a 12-month period, the Jewish forces were able to ethnically cleanse 800,000 people from their home, destroy 500 towns and villages, including schools and mosques and churches and whatnot. Some of these towns and villages were over 1,000 years old. They had a rich, long history, and they were destroyed and take over 80% of the land. So it's when you look at that and you compare it to the story of the myth of how Israel, the Jews were attacked and had to miraculously defend themselves and prevailed. You can see that one is a myth and one has a much more realistic aspect to it.
So what do you try to bring out through your book? What do you elucidate for the reader?
Well, to begin with, that there's a Palestinian story here which is valid and needs to be taken into account. Then beyond that, the fact that out of 10 million people or so who live between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, the country that we call Israel and the country that they call Palestine, we all share that land. All 10 million people share the land. All 10 people should have an equal say in the future of that land, so that they can move on beyond the conflict and live in their homelands together in peace.
Do you think that after the Arafat era, the Palestinians are willing to let the Jews live in lands that they want to reclaim?
Well, I think there's going to be some serious negotiations. I mean, the Jews are there. You know, you've got 5 or 6 million Israeli Jews, you've got about 5.5 million Palestinians. Everybody's there, no one's going anywhere.
Well, when Palestinians say we want to push the Jews into the sea.
Well, they don't say that. That's the thing. We say that they say that, but they actually don't say that. And so that's another part of the problem. You know, what we say that they say and how much of what we say they say is really true. Turns out a lot of what we say they say is not really true. And so that again is part of the problem. There's this gap. There's this segregation between the two sides. The two sides have never actually sat as equals at any negotiating table where they could actually determine their future together. And so whether there's a lot of hatred on both sides, certainly, whether there's a lot of animosity on both sides, certainly there is.
Yeah.
The thing is, we need to be able to sit together as equals, as equal partners in this land that we share, and move beyond the conflict.
And do you feel, or how confident are you that as equals, Muslims will let Jews live as peers?
I don't see any problem.
When Abu Mazen says that in the new declared Palestine, no Jews who are currently living in Judea and Samaria will be allowed to remain there.
This is an entirely different issue. We're talking about settlers we're talking about land that was stolen from their people. We're talking about the West Bank. We're not talking about complete equality everywhere. We're talking about two different things here, and that's a long, complicated question that will take a long time to answer. I don't know. I think it's beyond the scope of this of this conversation right now. But
again, what's the name of the book?
The book is The General Son: Journey of an Israeli in Palestine.
Available
on Amazon or on thegeneralson.com.
What's the domain?
Thegeneralson.com.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.